Chapter 37, The Scholar. Tress had given her room a cursory inspection when she'd moved in. She'd sorted through the things Weave had left, mostly to make certain nothing truly dangerous was hiding among them. Those earlier explorations had been the actions of a girl playing a role. Now she looked again as a girl trying to save her life. Where she had read, now she studied. Where she had arranged, now she organized. Where she had accepted, now she experimented. Nothing motivates quite like a deadline, particularly one that emphasizes the dead part. Tress didn't just pour her whole heart into the activity, she gave it her entire body, for a heart can't accomplish much without a nice set of fingers. Weave had not been an orderly person. Tress had hoped he'd left behind manuals of instruction. Instead, she found scraps and scrawled notes cluttered with collected tidbits and half-finished ideas, the sort of mental detritus that those unacquainted with genius often attribute to unfettered brilliance. In truth, there was no pattern to such a mess other than the subtle chaos of frustration, signs of a mind stretching beyond its limit toward ideas just beyond its reach. This can happen to a dunce as easily as to a genius. It's no proof of capacity, any more than a person too full for dessert is an indication of their weight. In Weave's case, the scraps were indicative of a mental hoarder, a person who collected ideas like a grandmother collects ceramic pigs. It was in the middle of realizing this and coming to understand that she would find no miracle solution that Tress ran across the first promising scrap. It was a detailed schematic for a cannonball with a scrawled message at the bottom indicating the captain had wanted Weave to figure out how to make them himself, so the ship wouldn't have to keep buying them at high prices from the Zephyr Masters. This intrigued Tress. She had a casual interest in the mechanics of cannonballs, like the way you might find yourself interested in the cuisine of a culture whose language you'd been learning. What held her attention, however, was the intricate use of spores inside them. Weave had been stymied. That much she could tell from his scrawled notes, which only served to distort and obfuscate the otherwise orderly diagram. Still, it depicted a sprouting technique she hadn't been aware of. By now, you've seen that a cannonball on Tress's world wasn't merely a lump of metal, but a piece of artillery, one I promised to explain in more detail. You see, each had a timer inside that after its launch would lead to a secondary explosion and a burst of water. Yes, you know that part already, but do you know how the timers were made? It turned out to be quite simple. The timer fuse was a vine. From the notes, Tress learned she wasn't the first to discover that applying water to an aether would cause it to continue to grow after its initial burst. The explosive emergence was erratic, but everything afterwards was far more predictable, even precise. An exactly measured verdant vine would grow at an extremely reliable rate when given an exactly measured amount of water. Yes, for those of you who care about those things like weather patterns, this growth eventually stopped, and given a vine would eventually exhaust all of its growth potential. Otherwise, people couldn't very well eat them. Getting the vines to the end of their growth potential was essential for turning them into emergency food. Anyway, the initial explosion that sent the cannonball soaring also broke a small glass container of water inside, soaking a clipping of verdant aether. That vine grew, pushing a plug with a bit of silver on the tip through a short tube through a central mechanism of the cannonball. This was a charge of zephyr spores surrounding a hollow sphere made of rosette. The rosette, it turned, had wax on the inside, which allowed it to contain but not touch a charge of water. The silver tip pushed through the zephyr spores, killing the small number of them, but leaving most unharmed, and then touched the rosette sphere, which cracked from the pressure of the silver. Water flooded out, touched the zephyr spores, and released their explosion, which detonated the entire mechanism, violently shooting out shrapnel and water. I have seen the modern designs, a note on the bottom said. She didn't think it was from Weave, but the original creator of the diagram, and agreed. Impact detonation charges are the future of artillery. She didn't know what that last part meant, but nonetheless, she found the diagram ingenious. Here were three different aethers working together: verdant for the fuse, roseate for the water container, and zephyr for the explosion. The central sphere didn't break from the initial firing of the cannonball because it was far, far stronger than glass, but it had a built-in weakness in that silver could damage it. In this design, she also discovered that wax could insulate an aether from water. She was in awe, and possible experiments ran through her mind. Now, it should be noted that experimenting with zephyr spores was usually an excellent way to be certain you went home in many small coffins instead of one large one. But as we've demonstrated previously, Tress possessed a common sense rare to many in her position. The sprouter profession attracts a self-selecting crowd. Normally, this includes uncommon individuals who have somehow survived their natural inclination to jump from idiotic heights into shallow water, or ride bicycles down mountainsides, or to eat unidentified brightly colored berries. The human species does need a certain amount of foolhardiness. Without that, people would have been too reasonable to do frightening things, like venture close to that very hot orange stuff that turns wood black and makes Tharg's beard smoke. But evolution is not a precise mechanism, and it has resulted in a certain number of people in the population with more nerve than neurons. Spore sprouting was only the latest in an increasingly shiny set of activities destined to neatly and violently cull such individuals from the gene pool. But Tress hadn't sought out the occupation, she'd fallen into it. She was intelligent enough to understand the charts and thoughtful enough to expand upon the ideas, and what she lacked in formal training, she more than made up for by being the type of person who used oven mitts even when a pot had been given time to cool down. It was at that moment the exact mix that innovation required. In fact, while some might call what happened next dumb luck, I would term it inevitable. There's no reason, Tress thought, loading up the schematic, why you couldn't make something like this that was portable. Not just a gun. Guns were common, and while useful, not particularly flexible. Could she improve upon that? What would a modular spore gun look like? A note at the bottom of the schematic, again added by the original creator, gave her the last piece she needed. Reference my schematic for flares, which iterates on this design. Moon of meanings, flare guns. The first few steps had already been taken. All Tress had to do was... A knock came at the door. Such a little interruption. A polite one, of the type Tress associated with her old life. Nonetheless, it shattered Tress's concentration like a thunder of 1,000 cannons firing at once. She leaped to her feet and threw open the door, uncharacteristically prepared to unleash a stream of verbal abuse upon the one who had so callously interrupted her. She found Fort standing outside, plugging the hallway, holding up a plate with a pot lid to keep it warm. He held up his sign. "You didn't pick up evening mess," it said. "Are you all right?" Tress blinked, then glanced out her room porthole. It had gotten so dark. She'd been squinting to read without realizing it. Soon, she'd need to light her lamp, a luxury afforded the sprouter that was denied common sailors. She put a hand to her head, pushing back her hair, trying to track the hours. Had she really been that enthralled? Moon of mercy, she'd been ready to snap it for it when he'd been so kind as to bring her some dinner. What had happened to her? Had some kind of spell on those papers made time vanish, or had she really been that interested? Remarkable. There weren't any cups involved, nor any windows. "Thank you for it," she said, taking the plate. She peeked underneath the cover and found the normal crusted slop leftovers. Today's offering might have once been some mashed potatoes and seagull, although it was difficult to tell through the char. She figured the meals probably weren't made of sawdust and rocks, despite the flavor, and since she hadn't died from any malnutrition yet. "You still owe me for all this," he noted. Captain never did order me to let you eat despite your new station. When we figure out the right payment, Tress mumbled, we can maybe start letting me have some. Can we maybe start letting me have some that isn't scraped off the bottom of the pot? Fort frowned. What? Tress, I saved some for you and Hoyd first thing before I let the dogs at it. You what? It hit her like a hammer to the skull. This wasn't leftovers. This is what everyone ate. Oh dear, she said. Fort had the decency to look down and shrug apologetically. We took turns after we've died, he wrote. I'm the best we have. Anne's concoction left half the crew sick for 3 days. Is that so? Tress said. Well, I think I've discovered a way I can repay you and the rest of the crew for the kindness you've shown me. Cooking here isn't easy, he warned, holding up his palm beside the board after he wrote the words. We only have sea rations, most of it stale, canned, or dried. It's hard to make it palatable. I think you'll be surprised, Tress said. Come get me tomorrow before you start cooking for evening mess. She trailed off as she heard the bell on deck ring out a warning. That wasn't the 3 heavy strikes indicating another ship had been spotted, but neither was it the call to mess, which was a constant ringing. It was 2 strikes, then quiet, then 2 strikes. What's that? She asked. Boarder ahead, Fort wrote, hand moving as quickly as he practically bounced with excitement. Crimson Sea has been spotted. Want to witness the crossing? Absolutely, she said, joining him in the hall, though she was strangely reluctant to leave her research. That was silly. She had no formal training in academics. Her schooling had ended at basic reading and arithmetic. Surely she wasn't secretly a scholar. A window washing girl? If she'd been inclined toward research, she'd have realized it before. The truth was, she simply never encountered a topic interesting enough or dangerous enough to engage her. And that's the end of chapter 37. Chapter 38, The Apprentice. I'm not sure I can recommend visiting the Spore Seas. While there are places in the Cosmere that are more deadly, few are casually dangerous. Other locations will kill you with a roar or a cataclysm, but the spores, they do it with a whisper. One moment you're enjoying a nice book. The next, you take in an unfortunate breath and a few crimson spores in your system, and suddenly you've turned your skull into a colander. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it seems somehow more unfair than dying from a lightning bolt or a hurricane. Nature is supposed to announce herself before murdering you. It's only sporting. That said, the Spore Seas do have some sights to sell. Fort made room for Tress by the prow, sending a couple of Dougs to watch from the rigging instead. It was evening, and this far away from the Lunagree, the green dome of the verdant moon drooped low on the horizon behind them, a mirror image to the crimson one ahead. A vast sphere in the sky peeking over the horizon with sun hovering above it like an eager sibling. Closer to the ship, just ahead, the verdant spores gradually mixed with the crimson, making a gradient where from a distance the center was a deep brown. The vibrant, shimmering red beyond this seemed like an ocean of blood, like the crimson moon had been shot and crow's song was sailing toward its corpse. Tress hadn't given thought to how wrong the color would feel. The emerald moon and sea had quite literally colored everything she'd ever seen. It intimidated her to realize she was leaving it and entering that wounded red ocean instead. She'd been watched by the verdant moon all of her life, and a very small piece of her, irrational though it was, worried she'd vanish the moment it stopped thinking about her. As they closed the distance, then crossed the border, Fort leaned against the railing and held up his sign. You're grinning. Sorry, Tress said. It's just that this is terrifying. You smile when things are terrifying? I didn't used to, she said. I think my brain is intimidated by how insane things are out here on the seas and is trying to fit in. Fort rubbed his chin, but didn't write anything else. She knew he was thinking about her supposed role as a king's mask and how she wasn't nearly as frightened of spores as she should have been. And again, it wasn't that. She was afraid. At the same time, she hadn't realized how terribly beautiful those red spores would be, nor how strange it would feel to be leaving the Emerald Sea. These were new emotions, like new flavors. They could be simultaneously terrifying and intoxicating. What else would she have never known about herself if she had never left her home island? Worse, how many people like her lived in ignorance, lacking the experience to fully explore their own existence? It's one of the most bitter ironies I've ever had to accept. There are unquestionably musical geniuses of incomparable talent who died as street sweepers because they never had the chance to pick up an instrument. The crow's song continued straight on into the Crimson Sea until one of the dugs in the rigging called out a warning. The sky has opened up and death was snaking toward them. Tress had never seen rain before. On her island, water came from wells. Though she'd been told about water falling from the sky, it always felt magical, mystical, the thing of stories. One of those stories apparently wanted to eat her, for the rain came streaking straight toward them, a knot of fast-moving clouds in the sky, trailing an explosion of aether in a line upon the ocean, a vast wall of crimson spikes that grew up and locked together with such force the clanking sound was audible from a great distance. Tress stood, mesmerized. Saleh, fortunately, had more experience here and was already turning the ship when the captain called out the order to do so. They veered hard, tacking to port and swerving lethargically back into the verdant. The rain line didn't give a chase, though it did turn upon the border of the sea, racing on ahead, leaving interlocking crimson spines 30 feet tall. Those eventually slumped and sank into the sea, leaving it pristine, calm, like a child who stuffed the broken cookie jar under the counter and assumed all would be forgotten. Moans, Tress breathed. What if this sea had stilled right then? What if we'd been unable to move? Fort glanced at his board to read what she'd said. His only response was a shrug. It was the sort of risk they would take sailing the Crimson. Tress turned toward the quarterdeck where Crow stood near the helm station, taking a long pull on her canteen. She lowered it and seemed thoughtful. She wouldn't dare press forward, would she? With that rain line slithering through the region? Helmswoman, Crow finally said, projecting her voice so everyone would hear. Kindly take us south a spell along the border. It seems imprudent to enter the Crimson at this moment. As you command, Captain, Saleh said. Crow swooped down to the main deck, then slammed herself into her cabin. Laggert hurried down the steps, nearly stumbling in his haste, then quickly covered the slip by shouting for the Dugs to get back to work. In minutes, they were sailing a leisurely course along the border. Fort excused himself to go scrub some pots, leaving Tress leaning against the ship's rail. Laggert stomped past Tress, then hesitated. You, he said, what do you think of this now? I honestly don't know, she replied. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it all. I can help with that, Dr. Ulam's voice called from nearby. Laggert grunted, then he gestured for her to follow. Curious, she joined him on the quarterdeck. Behind the helm and the captain's roost was an aft cannon set out on its own railed platform, like a heavily reinforced balcony sticking out of the very back of the vessel. It was a dangerous section of the ship, as it was far away from the silver protections. Spores that somehow leaped the gap between the sea and the deck here would take longer to die. That, of course, was important for the zephyr spores used as charges. Laggert rummaged in the gunnery barrel, an action that fortunately caused him to look down, because if he'd seen Tress's face, he might have noticed her sudden spike of worry. What was he doing? Was he going to confront her with one of the swapped cannonballs? Moons! She would have made a terrible spy. How could Saleh think, and the others possibly think, she was a king's mask? Tress didn't understand that it's quite possible to be so bad at something it seems implausible. In these cases, it stands to reason that such a person is in fact quite competent, because It takes true competence to feign such spectacular incompetence. It's called the transitive property of ineptitude and is the explanation for anything you've seen me do wrong ever. In this case, Tress's transitive ineptitude didn't come into play because Laggert didn't see how nervous she was, nor did he confront her with a fake cannonball. Instead, he selected an ordinary cannonball, then held it up as if admiring a beautiful painting. Or, considering the way his bald head on the end of his toothpick neck made him look, perhaps he was wondering if there was any relation. Now that we're proper pirates, he said to Tress, I figure we ought to have someone on this ship besides me and the captain who knows how to fire a cannon. The rest of the crew are too useless around spores to be trained. Congratulations. She noticed that, despite his bold words, he reached very gingerly into the gunnery barrel and selected a pouch of zephyr spores. Holding it pinched between two fingers, he quickly loaded it into the cannon through a latch on the top. Zephyr charge goes in here, he said, snapping the metal lid closed. Get them loaded quickly because even here, the deck silver is close enough to start killing spores. Inner casing there is lined with aluminum to block the silver's influence. He pushed a wad into the cannon and rammed it into place with a rod. This rag fills up the bore of the cannon, he explains, keeps the explosion from going around the ball. It puts full force on the shot. He slid a cannonball down the front of the cannon. It thumped into place. Cannon can't angle too low, otherwise we'd roll the ball out the front. All right, Tress said. But does the captain know you're having me do this? I'm cannon master, he snapped. Captain won't care who I train. You just do as you're told. Besides, a man needs to take care of himself. I don't want to end up wounded and then get sunk because nobody else on this damn ship has the guts to handle Zephyr. So, Laggert didn't know that she was to be sold to the dragon. This struck Tress as odd, since he seemed to know the rest of the plan. But then she realized there was a good chance the captain considered him as a backup sacrifice. He was one of the crew members who was least afraid of spores. Laggert picked up a small wooden contraption near the railing, then tossed it overboard. It proved to be a kind of small buoy with a flag tied by a rope to the ship. As they sailed, it trailed along far behind, like the most conscientious of stalkers. Take 5 shots a day, Laggert told her. The best way to get a feel for a cannon is to practice. He started to walk away. Wait, Tress said. You're not going to leave me any more training than that? Training would be useless until you know more, he said. I'm busy. Figure it out and don't bother me with your stupid questions. If you sink a buoy, congratulations. There are more in the hold. Come, bother me when you can do it in at most 2 shots, and then we'll talk about some real training. All right, Tress said, an idea occurring to her, but maybe I should start with something less expensive and wasteful than full cannonballs. We don't have a flare gun on board, do we? Could I try that out first? Kind of stupid question is that, Laggert said. It was identifiably the stupid kind of question, which at least is better than a redundant kind of statement. A flare gun is nothing like a cannon, he said. So just do what I told you, idiot, he continued muttering to himself as he stalked off. Tress folded her arms. She'd been planning to spend the evening either studying or trying to figure out how to crack Hoyd's curse. This was an unwelcome intrusion. Still, perhaps there were some advantages. If she was planning to build her own spore-based weapon to fight the captain, there were worse uses of her time than experimenting with a cannon. It was just that Laggert, by refusing to offer any useful training, had ensured she'd waste hours figuring out the basic mechanics of aiming the cannon. Even with this brief delay at the border, she knew her time was short. Depending on where the dragon's den was in the Crimson Sea, she had anywhere between a few hours and a few weeks to plan. A solution occurred to her only a moment later. She pushed the cannon forward, as she'd seen Laggert do. Then she smiled, took a firing rod, which had a bit of cloth at the end, and struck it through into the touch hole. A second later, An explosion rocked her, knocking the cannon back along its track. It took less than a minute for Anne's head to pop up behind, wide-eyed and eager. And that's the end of chapter 38.